Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me. And most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Please help us to spread the word by taking a minute to rate and review the show in iTunes and by telling your friends and colleagues. This week, I'm happy to introduce to you Nicole Lederer, Chair and co-founder of Environmental Entrepreneurs. The organization she created nearly 20 years ago was based on the premise that the economy and the environment are not divergent interests. E2 has proven time and again that sound environmental policy is actually beneficial to our economy. At its core, E2 is a network of about 1,000 leaders in business, and that tent has now broadened to include military leaders and farmers. And this growth is all part of Nicole's vision. She has a background in zoology and healthcare, but her true talent is in activating unlikely alliances and finding common ground across the political spectrum, something that is all too rare in the climate policy arena. I count myself as one of E2's flock, having first joined as a member about a decade ago, and then becoming one of the Northern California chapter directors a few years later. I have personally seen the strength of this network in training individuals in environmental advocacy at the state and federal level. In the past few years, E2 has produced clean energy job reports on states and regions throughout the country. These are fantastic resources to those working in or interested in working in the sustainability space. And you can find the most recent 2019 Clean Energy Job Report at e2.org. We've also written a bit about these reports at jobswithimpact.com. So Nicole Lederer, thank you for your time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dave.
So I want to learn a little bit more about your deep background. Tell me a little bit about how you grew up and what sort of impact your parents had on your world vision.
World vision. Well, I grew up in Sausalito, California, at a time when kids ran free. And I did run free a lot in what is now the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. When I was a child, it was just mainly Army land that was left pretty much undeveloped. And thanks to the efforts of many to keep it that way, it's now a national park. So that's where I spent my childhood, running around pretty much unsupervised, which was great. And it was no doubt partially that made me into a sort of born environmentalist. I've always felt that the natural world had both power and vulnerability that I just felt responsible for, and I still do. My parents probably didn't have that much to do with my orientation toward environmental issues, but toward taking responsibility for the world around me, they did.
How so?
Well, they were both war refugees from World War II, and the impact of politics and the influence it could have on the course of your life, the luck of the draw in terms of where you were born and what time you were born into. They all made a huge impression on me, and I figured I'd rather be on the end of determining what those politics were than being the victim of them. Not that anyone ever really has 100% of a choice on that, but I wanted to lean toward being more of an activist.
So you went to Berkeley for your undergrad. What did you study, and what was your reasoning in your course of study?
Well, I majored in zoology, which is essentially the same course curriculum as a basic biology major. And my reasoning was that I thought I might want to be a doctor.
Mm.
But a lot of the courses I took pointed me in a less human focused scientific direction and a more ecology focused direction. I was really fascinated by the science of how interconnected life is and how life evolves and how organisms interact. And um, my orientation was more toward a ecosystem perspective than a specifically human anatomy perspective.
And what was sort of the connection at that time to, from zoology and the study of ecosystems and animals to broader environmental issues? Was there a connection forming at that point?
I really think there was more of a connection to what I referred to earlier as just a deep-seated sense of responsibility and awe for the natural world.
Mm.
And that probably had something to do with my gravitating toward focusing my studies on the natural sciences.
Mm. And what is your understanding now of how people are incorporating natural sciences into environmental work? Is that a path that you see that students who are interested in both taking?
I can say that my background in the natural sciences has been a huge asset
Mm.
in understanding the fundamentals of good environmental policy. You can make a lot of mistakes trying to do good.
Yeah.
And having a scientific foundation to policy making, I think, is essential uh, to avoiding those kinds of bad mistakes, and also you don't get that many opportunities at bat when it comes to policy, and so you want to be sure to hone your language so that it truly has the impact you intend. If it's either overly specific in the wrong way or overly broad,
Mm.
you can wind up with outcomes you hadn't anticipated. And having the ability not only to think scientifically, but also to interpret the kind of information that's coming at you during policy forming work. It's a real asset, especially if you're working with people who have no science background, but, for example, are lawyers
Mhm.
or, industry representatives. So yes, it's come in really handy to have um, a biological perspective.
So you went on to work here in Palo Alto at Stanford. Tell me about your early career.
My early career was in medical research, and I worked both in a cancer biology research lab as a research technician and at Stanford Hospital as a clinical researcher in the intensive care nursery.
Mm. Wow. And how did that work? How did those experiences shape you?
Well, the first was a basic research job. So I executed the work in two separate laboratories, a tissue culture laboratory and a biochemistry laboratory. Um, and that was an exploration of how things work at the cellular level.
Mm.
I wanted to interact more with patients at a certain point, and when I transferred over across the street to the actual hospital, I got to work in a clinical setting with some of the really new technologies and medical applications that were being generated on the research side of the hospital being applied on the clinical side. And that was a great connection for me. It was also fascinating to work at that end of life, the pre-beginning
Mm.
of life, and to deal directly with both the human impacts of that and the moral questions that came up in the course of that work.
And to what extent at that stage of your life was uh, environmentalism playing a part or not?
Well, it was really tough to figure out how to make a career
Mm.
in the kind of work I do now. And in fact, at that time, I needed to make a living and support my husband, who was in graduate school, and eventually also children. So I found work that was commensurate with my educational background and that was really interesting, but it wasn't ever the thing that I was going to do that was original to me.
Hmm.
And so
And did you have a sense of what that might be at that time?
I would not say that I had been percolating on the idea of E2 for decades before I actually got around to doing it.
Sure.
I would say that people always tell you to pursue your passion, but it isn't always practically possible,
Yeah.
depending on life circumstances, to pursue your passion. I always knew what my passion was,
Mhm.
but how to execute on that passion, that became apparent when I was liberated from the need to have a steady income.
And did you plug in at that point to environmental work? At what point did you connect with NRDC?
I connected with NRDC probably the day after I had the idea that it was inexcusable that Silicon Valley was just so flush with cash and getting so much bad press around not being philanthropic enough, not being civic minded enough, and that never did the environment come up as a potential source or focus for business leaders here.
Mm.
And I had a window into that by living here through my husband's work, through the community, that environment wasn't even on the radar screen. And that seemed A, ignorant, B, a real loss of a natural opportunity and affinity
Mhm.
between the business community and an issue that affects business directly and where business could be a major actor for good. And also, when I was young, I was capable of being overly simplistic about, big business being bad and et cetera. And, sometimes it is. But it's also a major force to be directed, and it can be directed for good as well. And as I grew into sort of a more adult role, I realized that a lot of my peers had become those business leaders and held the same values that I do, and simply didn't have a vehicle to express those values or to influence others, which is how I came up with the idea of E2, that the business community is not comprised of anonymous villains, but of a whole lot of people
Mm. Right.
and that they share a lot of values with me and with one another, and they just need help and a platform to do the right thing.
So I guess I was under the impression that you were involved with NRDC before E2. Is that not the case?
As a
Did they sort of,
supporter,
you were a
I had
supporter?
been a major fan of NRDCs for probably 2 decades
Hmm.
before calling them up that day and
Hmm.
saying,
Let's do this.
"I want to do something for you that no other environmental group has, which is I want to build you a business contingent, to work with you, to support your work, and to build an advocacy community for pro environmental policy backed by business people to grow the economy."
And what was, now you co-founded E2 with Bob Epstein. So what was that connection and how did you guys come together on this?
So when I called NRDC, they said, "That's a really interesting idea. And we just brought a trustee on board who lives near you and who's part of the tech community. Perhaps you guys should meet." And so I can't remember whether I called Bob or he called me. We got together for lunch. And we both remember this. We met for lunch at a restaurant in San Jose. And literally on a napkin, we sketched out what E2 would be, both the more traditional notion of a support base, a financial support base for NRDC from a community that was suddenly incredibly flush with cash. But in my opinion, more importantly, a new advocacy component to environmental work, a whole new advocacy community that carries an enormous amount of inherent power and could do a whole lot in terms of furthering environmental objectives.
So how do you go about turning, people who are in business who may, think that environmentalism is a good cause, or they care about climate change, or they care about various environmental issues. How do you go about turning that interest into advocacy? How do you make someone into, because, maybe we should just explain. I mean, one of the functions that E2 provides for its members is advocacy training and an outlet for people to actually go to their state house and talk about these issues with legislators and or DC for that matter. But how do you do that?
It's actually a great process and a mutual learning process. I just prepared a delegation to go to DC. We just got back
Yeah.
last week. And that delegation was comprised of approximately half of people who've done this work with us multiple times, and they form the backbone of our delegation. They serve as models for the others. And the other half were people who were some new to E2, others new to advocacy with us. And the preparation process involves an in-depth interview that helps those individuals, each of them, the experienced and the new, to identify what positions they can take on our specific advocacy issues on which they have credible authority.
Mm.
So our issues this year were to demand immediate climate action from this new Congress and to urge them to seize the opportunities that are in front of them right now, one of which is to fund infrastructure that will include 21st century clean energy, transmission, storage, IT, transportation technology, so that we actually have an infrastructure system that is appropriate for the 21st century and will keep America competitive. And appropriations has to do with continuing to fund innovation and investment in American clean technology. And so each of these delegates was interviewed based on what their own backgrounds are and what their companies do and where they do it and how many people they employ in the process of doing those things where they do them. And through that process, we were able to identify what are the issues they can speak to from a knowledgeable business perspective, and which are the legislators with whom we should connect them based on where they generate economic growth and jobs. So it is actually a process of turning someone who is an expert in their own business into an expert in advocating for policies where they can express a business perspective that's relevant.
And what is the receptivity? I mean, and I imagine it's evolved over time, right? I mean, when you two started here in California, what was the tenor of the conversations and the receptivity of the legislators that you were talking to hearing the business voice?
Well, that's part of the fun part because, in the beginning, the tenor was surprise. There really weren't business leaders showing up to any debate on environmental issues that weren't the business leaders from those industries that were polluting the environment
Right.
and seeking to protect their ability to continue to do so. That was it. I mean, business was anti-environment and environmentalists were anti-business. So there was a lot of surprise around the fact that these were business leaders that were showing up to say, we do want to see environmental progress. We do want to see this issue addressed. We do want to reduce damage to natural resources. We do want to see efficiency policies instituted, and that all those policies actually benefit business in this state and in the country at large. And so initially it was surprise. And whenever we speak to a new legislator, it continues to be surprise. But the reception we get from legislators who've worked with us in the past is respect. They don't always agree with us and they don't always do what we're asking, but they take the meeting. They want to know what they're going to be dealing with if they don't act on the issues we take a stand on. They need to understand why business people are taking the positions they are on these issues, because these legislators answer to their constituents. And that is something they need to be very cognizant of when they vote. I could tell a story now about how we passed the extension of the California global warming law. And in answer to your question, how do legislators respond? And again, we are nonpartisan, and we don't ask for the party affiliations of our members. In fact, we'd prefer not to know. And we work with any legislator that will work with us. And we work exclusively on our issues, not on collateral issues, et cetera. So as you know, Dave, E2 was very active. In fact, perhaps the central business voice in passing California's global warming law, as well as certain landmark environmental laws prior to that around the climate issue. But it was almost unbelievable to me that when it came time to pass the extension of that law, there was, in fact, a very real possibility that it would be defeated. And a large reason for that possibility, despite the great benefits that had accrued to the California economy, almost statewide, or in fact statewide, the reason was that the fossil industries had built strong relationships with what we call in the state the moderate Democrats, Democrats who generally represented non-coastal districts, who represented less affluent districts, and who had legitimate concerns about whether benefits from California's global warming policies were were accruing to their constituents. Mm-hmm. And the fossil industries were taking major advantage of those doubts and also funneling a great deal of support, financial support to those legislators. So we generated research on exactly what was the impact to those districts, economically speaking, from California's global warming law. And we're able to produce individual reports for each assembly district and ultimately each Senate district of the California legislature. And those reports showed the millions of dollars that were flowing into every California district.
From cap and trade
funds.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of clean economy jobs in those districts. And we were able to go to those legislators in the company, in many cases, of their constituents. And we were able to publicize that research in their regional and local newspapers. The result was that those legislators were faced with the very real question, what's best for my constituents? Right. Which is exactly what they should be asking. That's the responsible thing for a legislator to do. We were able to provide them with the information. The key here was that we were also able to provide their constituents with that information. That is one way to communicate with legislators that they will definitely sit up and take notice of. Yeah. And in that way, we were able to counteract the influence of a lobbying entity that has infinite funds and infinite reach.
So I want to make sure that in the show notes for this episode that I link to one of those fact sheets, because they're incredibly well done and powerful. And just as you were saying, I mean, they equip these legislators with the data that shows the kind of inflows that their local economies are receiving and the kind of jobs that are being created. E2 has done a lot more.
And I want to say, Dave,
Mhm.
that data is both a carrot and a stick, and
Mm,
that's up to the legislator to decide.
right,
Are you going to claim responsibility for the great
right.
for the great results of the cap and trade system in California's global warming law that you have delivered to your district? Or are you going to explain to your constituents why you're voting against those benefits to the district and to your constituents?
Yeah.
You get to choose. It's the carrot or the stick. Either way, your constituents are going to know about it because E2 does direct advocacy. We do research and reports, and we do communications. And each of those three is essential to getting our policy work done.
So how is that model viable, and how is it different outside of California where you don't have cap and trade funds? There are obviously clean economy jobs, and Z2 has done a lot of work in quantifying those jobs.
Right.
But the direct funding sources are less obvious than cap and trade. So how are we using the model in other parts of the country, and how is the model different?
Actually, the model for the California reports originated with a national clean
Hmm.
energy jobs report produced by E2 and ultimately adopted by the Department of Energy under Secretary Moniz. Now that he's back in the private sector, there's a new consortium of organizations, including E2, that continues to produce these reports at both the national and at then state level. So now we're producing reports in many states. And in many of those reports, we actually drill down to the, again, district level, whether it's county, state legislative, or federal districts. So we're making that information available to legislators across the country. And how it works without cap and trade, I mean, the fact is that these jobs are nationwide, and there are well over 3 million of them, and that there are, and they're fairly geographically democratic in their distribution because so many of these jobs are small business jobs, the lifeblood of any politician.
Mhm.
So,
Give a couple examples of where you see most of the job activity coming from these reports.
well, a lot of the job activity is in the energy efficiency retrofitting space. So, what's so great about those jobs is that they employ general and trade specific contractors
Hmm.
to make existing buildings more efficient and to save consumers money. So, state policies that help to underwrite efficiency operations for businesses and for residential retrofitting are extremely popular because ultimately the consumer saves money on their energy bills, which is important in any state, but extremely important in states that suffer through major winters and major summers.
Yeah.
So the energy efficiency space is one arena where there's just a lot of job creation across the country. But I would say the next arena that is really important is in the solar and wind generation space. So renewable energy generation is a big job creator. A lot of veterans are going into that space, in large part because they are discharged with a significant amount of technical know-how
Mm.
and segue naturally into um, installation and troubleshooting and maintenance of solar and wind machinery, and find themselves, well matched to that kind of work. And the employers love hiring veterans because, generally speaking, they've had great experiences with how veterans can just jump right in and do the job. So, whether it's efficiency or generation, those are two traditional areas of job generation. But increasingly, there are jobs in the technologies that are going to support the ever more massively deployed clean energy space, and that is jobs in developing battery technology and both developing and building out a new transmission system, and of course the enormous amount of IT that is going to happen and is happening around energy generation, distribution, storage.
And the E2 regional reports profile get
All
down
of
to
the above.
specific
Yes.
sectors.
Yes.
So it's a great resource. And how have you seen, again, kind of looking at, well, I guess what started as a national model and then translated into California. Talk a little bit about the proliferation of E2's work in states and regions across the country. I know that we're seeing a lot of momentum in the Northwest and in the Midwest, for example. Where do you see the most promise?
Well, we now have chapters and staff on the ground in the Pacific Northwest, Northern and Southern California, Rocky Mountains out of Denver, Midwest out of Chicago, New England out of Boston, New York, and we just put staff in North Carolina. And in each of those regions, we see enormous opportunity. I will talk with you about an area that I am really enthusiastic about, having spent the last 18 months or so focused on this. And it's a story that also illustrates how E2 is functioning. One of the most important functions of E2 is to broaden the tent of constituencies that see themselves as benefiting from environmental protection
Right. So
and
beyond,
strong
beyond
environmental
business.
performance. Business, very broadly defined, I've come to understand, is everybody.
Sure. Okay.
Everybody needs
Yeah.
to make a living.
Right.
Now,
I guess
as you know,
I guess it's beyond what we think about as business in Silicon Valley, where all this started. But,
it's this divisive thinking that has caused everybody to get into their silos. The fact is, this world we live in is the world all of us live in, and it impacts all of us personally and professionally in myriad ways. So I've always believed that we need to define this constituency as all inclusive, but very often neither the environmental community nor certain other communities view themselves as having anything in common. Well, you ask which part of the country do I think holds the most promise? I would not pick one out as having more promise than another, but one that's been fantastic is the Midwest, where we have connected very strongly with the farm community. And this was an opportunity to work with ag groups, with specific representatives of various crop producers, with people in the ag tech community that are working with farmers. And
can you just pause and describe ag tech? Maybe give an example or two. What does that mean?
Ag tech broadly refers to the technologies that enhance agricultural operations efficiency so that crops can be produced with fewer inputs of pesticide and fertilizer, and in some cases irrigation, with less crop machinery time that also represents a significant fossil input for fuel. So the inputs are reduced through precision ag, which is a term that refers to technologies that allow you to use those inputs on a plant-by-plant basis instead of crop dusting from the air, for example. So ag tech refers both to the precision ag side of the equation and also to the carbon removal side of the equation. On the precision ag side, you are reducing the fossil-intensive inputs. On the carbon removal side, you're actually reducing atmospheric carbon by sequestering it in the soil. And there are a number of really quickly growing technology sectors on both sides of that equation. On the precision ag side, the most obvious technology to point to is drone technology that allows you to view your fields on a square foot by square foot basis and identify exactly where an application of pesticide, fertilizer, or even water is required. On the carbon removal side, we know people who are developing soil microbe additives that are responsible for fixing more carbon in the soil and increasing soil health and crop resilience and productivity. So there's a whole slew of technologies being developed to improve resilience, productivity, and carbon fixing in farming.
And what are the policy drivers that E2 is working on to enable some of these
So
technologies?
there really haven't been, to my knowledge, many policy drivers that were specifically around enhancing carbon removal. Soil health is an issue that has concerned farmers forever. Modern farming policy, however, has generally driven farmers away from many of the practices that enhance soil health. So E2 sought to work with the farm community to develop a provision in the Farm Bill that just passed in December of 2018 that would recognize those agricultural practices that increase carbon sequestration in the soil, incentivize and reward those practices, and measure exactly how much carbon is being sequestered through those practices so that farmers can qualify to sell carbon credits in existing and future carbon markets, which would provide farmers with an entirely new revenue stream, not dependent on weather, not dependent on tariffs. It would essentially be an insurance measure for farmers to guarantee a revenue stream in a new farm product, namely carbon sequestration. So E2 worked with a coalition. We actually assembled a coalition of ag groups, individual farmers, and our environmental partner, NRDC, was very active, and our own members from the ag tech community to craft a bill, a provision to be included in the Farm Bill. And thanks to the breadth of our coalition, which encompassed across the political spectrum, I mean, we're talking about ag groups that are traditionally quite conservative, environmental groups that are traditionally more left-leaning, our group that sits squarely in the middle and, like Switzerland, will not declare. We together walked the halls of Congress with this proposal and got into offices that neither group could have gotten into alone. But as a coalition, we were able to take meetings with just about every member of the congressional ag committees and get this thing passed.
It's incredible, especially in this environment. I mean, we're talking now in March of 2019 when partisanship is, at an all-time high, and we're, living through an administration that is running counter to a lot of strong environmental policies. That's a real achievement. Early on, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to say that the two big outcomes of this are, first of all, that the ag community and the environmental community work together productively. This is really important for whatever comes next, that we were able to create respectful and productive working relationships between two groups that haven't worked productively, particularly in the last many years, is really important. The second piece that's really important is that by creating an incentive, a financial incentive for farmers around recognizing carbon sequestration as a valuable product, we are also securing their support in the future for a national carbon policy. It will benefit them. They will profit from that, and they will see an inherent value in it. I'm sure that the map around which states support carbon policy and which don't will be altered by this. The last thing that you have to say is we passed a carbon bill. We passed a climate bill in 2018.
Which bill are you referring to?
The provision in the Farm Bill.
Which is undercover.
Well, you could say
Well,
the least talked about
which is why
climate
it
bill
happened.
in the
Yeah.
history of the
Yeah.
U.S., but it is there, and it was supported by an extremely bipartisan coalition of conservative farm states and others.
So, in my view, this success, this work with the ag community in passing a climate bill, masked as a farm bill or within a farm bill.
It wasn't masked. It was never hidden. But what it did was it found it clearly articulated the common benefits to all the constituents.
So this achievement was foreshadowed by work that E2 and other environmental groups were doing with in creating alliances with the defense Department of Defense and the defense industry to some extent. Talk to me a little about that. I was there for some of those meetings. Must have been 6 years ago at the Pentagon, and
2011, 2012.
yeah. Talk to me about why the climate message and really probably more than that, the sustainable energy message is so resonant and so compatible with the national security
Well,
message.
this was another discovery of fellow travelers on the same road that had a completely different orientation about why they were going after exactly the same things we go after. So I would never say that the Pentagon decided climate change was important because we told them so. What happened was, this is how I came to it, I read a speech that was given in 2011, I believe, by then Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus. And in that speech, he articulated the standards he was setting for the Navy in reducing their fossil energy use, in increasing their efficiency of energy use, and in addressing the climate challenges that were putting the entire U.S. military at greater risk of having their resources stretched very thin, of not being able to execute on their mission, whatever that may be. Ray Mabus basically said climate change is real. It's a national security risk. It's putting our men and women who are deployed at risk. And we need to alter the way the U.S. military does business in such a way as to mitigate those risks and reduce our impact on climate change, which is a global threat multiplier. So for me, it was a huge wake-up call that the military, without the luxury of being able to interpret world events through a strictly political lens, were now the spokespeople for giving veracity to the climate change debate, that there really is such a thing as climate change and we really do have to deal with it. So we went over there and started meeting with the leaders in the Pentagon on these issues, from the Navy, from the Army, from the Air Force, and from the Marines. And we met fascinating people in each service that each had their own mandate to lower their fossil fuel consumption, diversify their low carbon fuel supply chains, and to reduce their energy use overall, both on bases stateside and in forward operating bases. And it was interesting because the forward operating bases became the labs for advanced technologies to allow them to operate without using as much liquid fuel as they required. In bases like Afghanistan, you've got to air condition tents. And in Afghanistan, or Iraq, that can be an incredibly energy intensive and wasteful activity. So they were doing everything from insulating tents to finding new ways to generate energy. The average soldier was carrying something like 60 pounds of batteries when deployed. They wound up contracting for solar tarps that soldiers can carry in their packs and simply unfoil them. Is that
Unfurl.
unfurl them and put them out in the sun and then charge their batteries off these tarps. So everything from cutting edge to simply making base housing more efficient, they've taken it all on.
What's interesting to me is that, is this pattern of finding allies in non-obvious places, right? Starting with the very genesis of E2, which is, okay, here's a business community that, as you said, really didn't have a stand on environment for a very long time. And through E2's early work, that started to change. And then through creating this collaboration of fellow travelers in the defense business, we were able to expand that message and help it cross
Right.
cross party lines even further. And now in ag, what additional you know opportunities do you see in other sectors that maybe have more traditionally have more conservative political leanings, or just aren't orientated because of the work they do towards environment? So what's the next frontier?
I really think that it's become a matter of unifying the country the way we were unified when we were faced with an existential crisis in World War II.
Mm,
And if you ask me how my parents have influenced where I am
mm,
today, I'm the kid of a U.S. Army veteran who described the amazement he felt when he watched this country mobilize. He was trained my dad was trained as a 40-day wonder, which was a college graduate who became an officer in 40 days. And he trained with a broomstick as a rifle substitute. And what happened in the following months and years in this country to meet a challenge that we were so deeply unprepared for makes me believe that we can do that and must do that and have the ability to do that again. And so when you ask, what is the next frontier? I think what E2 has proven is that the environment, for lack of a better designation of this slate of issues, affects us all and has become a threat to our children. And the next frontier, which E2 has been building toward, is to depoliticize it, to get it, to no longer allow it to be pigeonholed as an issue of the few or an issue of people who live here but not people who live there, or people who vote this way or not. This is something we have to take on together. We need each other. We need each other's skills. We need to be respectful of one another's differences. But on this, we're in the same boat and we need to start rowing real fast. So that's what I view as more the culmination of what we've done rather than the next frontier. We've identified issues with broad impacts and greatly broaden the definition of who should and does care about those issues. We've demonstrated that those people can come from really different walks of life and really different identity groups. And we've demonstrated how they can work together productively and learn a lot from one another in the process. So that's the next frontier. It's time, it's go time.
okay, so that's a great clarion call. And for those that hear that call, where do they start? So you identified some big pools of jobs, over 3 million jobs. A lot of them are in the trades and general construction for energy efficiency and solar installation. By some of the counting I've done, it's actually bigger than that. And if you include things like corporate sustainability and policy work and some of the advocacy work as well. This is a broad question because as we're just outlining, these jobs fall in lots of little pockets across the economy.
Hmm.
But where does the work need to be done? If you're, giving advice to maybe we can talk about two different groups. People coming out of school
Hmm.
now,
Hmm.
they hear the clarion call. They have mixed backgrounds, maybe STEM and liberal arts. What are some of the opportunities you see?
I would say and do say to young people looking for where can I make a career, that this is the fastest growing sector in the American economy, that there's an enormous opportunity here not only to be creative and to make a good living, but also to do something really important for the country. And whether they go into companies that are directly related to a clean economy, renewable energy generation, or any of the other technologies we've talked about, or whether they go into companies that have strong policies around their own operations, not directly related to energy, for example, but where they procure their energy or how they manufacture whatever they produce, or any number of different ways that our businesses interface uh, with all of these issues, with resource management and efficiency, pollution, uh, et cetera. I mean, choose what you do to have a positive um, outcome on the way we survive on this planet. And you'll be choosing a business that has a good outlook. You'll be choosing a business that has a sustainable plan for being in business in the long term.
Right.
So that's what I would say to young people. Don't ignore this. This is going to be the issue that will determine not just not just the sustainability of our planet, but the sustainability of your career.
You've covered a few of the technologies that are really taking shape and sectors, right? From
Hmm.
energy efficiency to the generation side, to advanced automotive. You mentioned storage as being necessary. Actually, all of
All
those.
of the above, yeah.
Where is the most growth, or where do you see the most need from a technology perspective? Understanding that it's not a silver bullet.
Well, I think it's really important that our energy generation sector is now colliding big time with our transportation sector. I think the biggest need and the most exciting arena that I'm aware of is this space where we'll no longer generate energy exclusively from in a very centralized way with giant power plants that then send energy only outward. We are transitioning to a distributed energy generation system where there are a lot more generators, both perhaps municipal sized generators all the way down to individual homes and cars,
Mhm.
that will both be generating and storing energy and transmitting it back and forth on the grid. So what we're looking at is a whole new system of powering both our transportation systems and our energy systems, and they'll interact. And moving toward transportation electrification is speeding that melding, which is why E2 is working on infrastructure at the federal level to look at both of those sides of infrastructure as integrated. So I think that is an area that's changing really fast. It's going to change the way we live very soon, and for which we need to prepare immediately.
So, environmental entrepreneurs is a collection of entrepreneurs
And others.
and others. But I think the genesis of it was people that were starting companies, or
Of an inventive state of mind.
and in so doing, you became. But in creating this business, this initiative, um, you are an entrepreneur, and E2 is about to celebrate its 20th. What has been the biggest setback along the way?
I would say there has been something I feel is a setback, and I'm not sure we've overcome it. And that is, it's taken 20 years, and it's not done yet.
Meaning saving the planet?
Meaning unifying American politics around the both downside of inaction in the face of these challenges and the upside of addressing them aggressively and creatively. That when there really is such a positive outcome to accepting that we have issues that we must address and such a penalty for not addressing them, I would expect us to be further along than we are now. And E2 has not succeeded clearly from the administration we currently have and the ideas they still promulgate and the number of people that still accept those ideas. We haven't succeeded in the goal that we set out as much as I feel I wish we had. So could we have done better, and how? I do ask myself that a lot, and if any of your listeners have any good ideas, I am very open to hearing them.
What are you proudest of?
I'm proudest of the community, of the many, many, many people I have met who have taught me something and who've trusted me and who I trust, and of those many, many people who've met one another and learned about how much they have in common and how respectfully and productively they can work together. And people who really wouldn't have met under any other circumstances. And in that way, I feel a little bit like I am having the experience my dad had in the American Army. Again, back to that we really need to pull together. My father was exposed to people from all over this country who spoke the language in so many different accents and had so many different levels of education and expertise, but who together accomplished something truly, truly remarkable. I feel like I'm seeing a little bit of that through this work. And that's been the thing that has rewarded me the most in doing it for the last almost 20 years.
Well, we'll end on that positive note. And Nicole Lederer, I want to thank you for your time, for hosting today, and for the incredible work that you've done in creating this organization.
Thank you, Dave, for all the extremely important work you've done in this space. I really appreciate it.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please tell your friends and give us a rating and review on iTunes. See you next episode.